Since 1948, we have had many different live-action theatrical Superman movies. So which one is the best? Welcome to the Summer of Superman. Our journey through Superman's theatrical roller coaster ride has come to an end. The Summer of Superman will continue for a few more weeks, but today we determine the best theatrical Superman movie. Some little admin here to get out of the way. I will be including the serials. They were theatrically released and they are in live action. I will also include a couple of movies that don't actually feature the character of Superman, but at least in the comic world, they are a part of the Superman extended family. However, I will not be including the Justice League films. I'll better explain why as we get more towards the end. Also, if you want my more in-depth, deeper thoughts on these films, with the exception of the two that don't actually feature Superman, I've made separate videos on all of them. So without further ado, let's get started.
Johnny! It's hammer time!
Well, I'll be dipped in shit and rolling breadcrumbs.
In last place is 1997's Steel, starring the great master thespian Shaquille O'Neal. For years, along with 2004's Catwoman, this has always pretty much been one of my go-to answers for the worst comic book movies ever made. Steel stars Shaq, who is not necessarily someone known for his acting. Ultimately, it uses John Henry Irons' name and the character name and superhero name of Steel, who was popular at the time in the comics due to the death of Superman and the reign of the Superman storylines, which I am a huge, massive fan of. The movie itself, though, is horrendously acted with horrible special effects, and the action is so slow and just plain lame. Shaq is a world-class athlete and an NBA legend. That being said, there is a reason he does not run the 100-yard dash at the Olympics. There is a whole scene that I'm pretty sure is meant to be this big action set piece in a train yard and is played in all complete seriousness. That is a superior athlete chasing a criminal. But in execution, it's just Shaq slowly stumbling around a bunch of train tracks, chasing a kid who is clearly faster than him.
It's great! He's just flying around. Shh! You can't just blowing in the wind like this. Shh! Look like a flag.
And second to last, at number 13, I have Superman 3. If you're basing this purely on the technical filmmaking, it deserves to probably be slightly higher. Not too much higher, but a little bit higher than this. This was a director and a producer that didn't really have any major connection to the character of Superman and the comic books of Superman, and didn't really understand the character. But they were huge Richard Pryor fans. So what do you get? A Richard Pryor film with a Superman storyline thrown into it. The Superman side of things, in terms of revisiting Smallville and rekindling a potential romance with Lana Lang, that stuff I pretty much enjoy for the most part. Ultimately, though, it's a movie with a Timu Lex Luthor, a Timu Eve Tessmacher, and a Timu Brainiac, but it never actually gives us any of those characters. Comedy is a very generational and timely thing. My favorite comedy films were pretty much all released within the same 5 to 10 years of each other, so Richard Pryor isn't really my type of comedy. And this feels like a Richard Pryor movie. Ultimately, it's this low because it just feels the most insulting to the source material, more so than the other movies on this list that might have worse technical qualities.
Effective immediately, I'm going to rid our planet of all nuclear weapons.
At number 12, we have Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. I do weirdly enjoy this movie, even with how badly it's made. I like how it feels like the 1960s nuclear age Superman story and kind of a nuclear age comic book from the 60s brought to life. That being said, this was made in 1987. I like what they are doing with Superman and exploring how Superman would react to the threat of nuclear warfare. This is a movie that was created by people who had a clear passion and vision, and they clearly respected the character of Superman. However, they didn't have the budget, they didn't have the resources, the studio didn't have the same passion as the creators did, and then the studio in post-production cut a very substantial amount of scenes from the film, so the ultimate final version ends up being a really bad movie.
The Omega Hedron, Selena. I want it.
Well then, Supergirl.
Up next, we have 1984's Supergirl. Similar to Superman 4, this is a bad movie that I weirdly enjoy. The story is nonsensical. Supergirl is giving a ticking time bomb. Her home world is going to die in 4 days if she doesn't find the Omegahedron on Earth. So when she gets to Earth to find the Omegahedron and she has 4 days on this ticking time clock, what does she do? She enrolls in college. And, spends presumably a week in college while her home world is dying. That being said, I get a lot of fun out of the villain and the villain arc in this movie. You get this witch that finds the Omegahedron, and she's able to use a love potion. Granted, the love potion goes wrong, and the guy falls in love with Supergirl instead, or Supergirl's secret identity instead of the villain witch. That being said, it is a bad storyline, but weirdly enough, it gives me Halloween Town vibes. Now, don't get me wrong, this came out well over a decade before any of the Halloween Town movies came out. But as someone who grew up watching the Halloween Town movies on Disney Channel, I get a weird, charming, nostalgic feel from this movie because part of it does feel very Halloween Towny. Some of that is also a negative because it does feel like very much a TV movie and sort of like the Disney Channel Supergirl. Supergirl is my favorite bad Superman movie, and this is the point in the ranking where we jump from thumbs down, bad movies, to sort of the flatline, middle-of-the-road films.
Did you succeed in getting that coin from the Planet office?
No. Unfortunately, it fell into the hands of Superman.
And kicking off the top 10 of, granted, only 14 movies, we have Atom Man versus Superman. This is the second Superman serial and the original Superman sequel. It features the first ever live-action depiction of Lex Luthor, played by Lyle Talbot. This is very much a 1950 version of a live-action cartoon. There is still a lot to love about Atom Man vs. Superman. I really enjoy Lyle Talbot's Luthor. He's a very underrated, underappreciated, and forgotten about Luthor. Nobody ever talks about him when it comes to the live-action Lex Luthors, but he does a great job. In an era where Lex Luthor is just a criminal mastermind, mad scientist in the comics, this version still has some elements of a public figure respected Luthor, a respected businessman, or more of a rehabilitated businessman, even though he's not actually rehabilitated. The best thing about this serial is Lyle Talbot, but I really do enjoy Kirk Alyn's Superman and Noel Neal's Lois Lane. All three of them are very underrated versions and forgotten versions of those characters. The reason it's this low is the story goes everywhere. It's a very cartoonish story, and sometimes that can be a good thing. But in this instance, it's not always a great thing. There are random time jumps that never really get explained, and they're not even really shown to you. You just kind of realize randomly that a year has passed, but you don't know when in the movie that time jump happens. You get Luthor getting imprisoned, rehabilitated, released, and becoming a businessman all in one chapter. You have Ghost Superman. You have Lois Lane going undercover at Luthor's company. You have flying saucers and torpedoes in the last chapter. Lastly, you have a very misleading title that suggests an Atom Man who will go toe-to-toe with Superman. But in all reality, Atom Man is literally just an alias for Lex Luthor. He doesn't have any powers, and he just wears a shiny helmet.
Don't forget, you invaded his world. You sank a pipe 6 miles into the ground. And when he climbed up, you set dogs on him, shot him.
And next up, we have Superman and the Mole Men. I was going back and forth between Superman and the Mole Men and Atom Man versus Superman in terms of which one I'm going to put higher. Ultimately, I decided that Superman and the Mole Men I put higher primarily because while they are both extremely dated, Superman and the Mole Men is less than an hour long, while Atom Man versus Superman is a serial. So if you sit down and watch it as a film, you binge through the chapters, it's going to be a long night. Plus, Superman and the Mole Men has one of Superman's greatest monologues and one of my favorite Superman scenes when he's standing in front of the hospital protecting one of the mole men from the angry mob of townsfolk. It's a movie that does very much understand the character of Superman and what he represents, and I appreciate it for that. However, it's not a Metropolis story. I don't care too much for the Phyllis Coates Lois Lane. George Reeves is a great Superman. However, there is no nuanced difference between his Superman performance and his Clark Kent performance. Now, I did purchase a box set earlier this year of the TV show, and I've been slowly making my way through it, and it doesn't really get much better with George Reeves' difference between his Clark Kent and his Superman. That being said, the best part of this TV series is not in Superman and the Mole Men, and that is Jimmy Olsen. The Adventures of Superman by far has the best Jimmy Olsen. Ultimately, it's this low because it's an extremely dated movie that feels like an extended episode of a television show. I enjoy it more as a piece of comic book movie history than I do as a movie in and of itself.
Well, here I am.
Next, at number 8, we have Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice. This is potentially the most divisive movie on this list. If you would have asked me 5 years ago, even the Ultimate Edition, I would have put in the thumbs down bad section of this list. However, I do consider myself a Zack Snyder fan. I prefer him more as a director than I do as head of DC Creative. That being said, Watchmen is one of my favorite movies of all time and one of my top 10 comic book movies. I like his style, I like his direction. I have just never liked this movie. I like the stories surrounding Superman and Batman and how Lex is manipulating both of them as well as the media and politicians. I like all of that. I love the Hans Zimmer and Junkie XL score, and I love the visuals. But this movie loses me with two key elements. One of them is how Lex Luthor is written. The story surrounding him I like, but him as this Mark Zuckerberg, Silicon Valley tech tycoon bro who acts like the Riddler does not work for me. I don't blame Jesse Eisenberg. I do think he was the perfect casting for this version of Lex Luthor. I just don't like this version of the character. But what really gets me, what I really have never liked about this film, about BVS, is the third act being a rushed and horrendous adaptation of the death of Superman, which is probably one of my personal favorite Superman stories, along with Jeff Johns' Superman Brainiac. I go more in depth into this in my BVS video, but if they would have just replaced Doomsday with Amazo, I probably would love this movie. As is, it's a movie I used to hate with a passion, but as a Zack Snyder fan, I have grown to tolerate it as a passable way to get from point A to point B, with point A being a movie I grew to love over time, and point B being a movie I loved the second I watched it. The next two movies are movies that I still love, and I would still give them a thumbs up, but I wouldn't call them great. Next, we have Superman Returns. This is by far the movie that has fallen the most throughout the years. For most of my life, this was actually my favorite live-action Superman movie. But as I've gotten older and started to appreciate the good Christopher Reeve movies more and read more of the source material, it hasn't necessarily sat perfectly well with me over time. That being said, I still love it. I still think the best Superman action set piece ever put to film is in this movie with the airplane sequence. I think name Redacted's Lex Luthor separating the art from the artist is one of the best Lex Luthor performances we've gotten in live action. And now watching it after having seen Atom Man vs. Superman, I feel like the performance is more reminiscent of Lyle Talbot than it is of Gene Hackman, even though clearly it's supposed to be reminiscent of Gene Hackman. I still think it has the best Metropolis and Daily Planet production designs. The reason I can't put it in the great section is because its runtime drags on and is a little too long, and I'm not a fan of Kate Bosworth's performance as Lois Lane. Coming in at number 6 is 1948's Superman, the original live-action Superman. For reference, when I made this video series, this was my first time watching this. It wasn't my first serial, however, I had seen the Batman ones, the Captain Marvel one. I had even seen the Greg Saunders Vigilante serial. The Adventures of Captain Marvel was enjoyable, but the two Batman serials and the Vigilante serial, they just didn't do it for me. However, this is by far my favorite serial that I have seen yet. Kirk Alyn is extremely underrated and forgotten about. His Superman is very much a classic Midwestern Boy Scout that is just trying to save people, and his Clark Kent performance feels separate from his Superman performance. Clark Kent feels like an ordinary, mild-mannered reporter as opposed to the stoic Superman. Noelle Neal might actually be my favorite theatrical Lois Lane. The main thing holding this back, and this could change over time, but it's the serial runtime. It's a serial with 15 chapters, so if you watch it as a movie in one sitting, it's still going to be a long run. But unlike all of the other serials, I never felt the runtime. I just enjoyed it and watched it all the way through in one sitting. However, it is very dated. They decided not to use any flying special effects that did exist at the time, which they did try to rectify with Atom Man vs. Superman, but I don't think it worked quite as well. And so in this movie, they kind of just have it where whenever Superman's flying, it's literally, essentially, a Fleischer cartoon on top of a live-action background. That being said, there are some very impressive moments, in my opinion, where it transitions from a live-action Kirk Alyn into a flying Fleischer cartoon. Now, the top 5 are all movies that I think are great. That being said, I don't think any of them are necessarily top 10 comic book movies of all time. Top 20, maybe, probably, but I don't think they're top 10 of all time.
That's kryptonite, Superman. Little souvenir from the old hometown. I've spared no expense to make you feel right at home.
And coming in at number 5 is the original 1978 Christopher Reeve Superman. I feel like most people, not all, but most, will still have this at number 1. For me, I never grew up with the Christopher Reeve movies. The Superman or men that I grew up with were Tim Daly, George Newbern, and for live action it was Tom Welling. I didn't watch these until I purchased the Ultimate Collector's Edition, and the main reason I purchased the Ultimate Collector's Edition was because I loved DC and I loved Superman as a character. That being said, it is still a great movie. The first act especially is a phenomenal, epic origin that rivals any comic book movie and any sci-fi movie we've seen to date. Marlon Brando is one of my favorite traditional thespian actors. I don't think anyone will be able to outdo his Jor-El. Superman has all of these powers, but the one thing he can't stop is a heart attack, which leads to a gut-wrenching moment involving his Earth father, Jonathan Kent. Christopher Reeve is still probably the best we've seen from an actor being able to portray both Superman and Clark Kent and transitioning between the two, sometimes even within the same scene and the same cut. Margot Kidder, while she might not be my personal favorite overall, she is still a great Lois Lane. Gene Hackman does a great job playing a dated version of Lex, but keep in mind it wasn't necessarily dated in 1978. What holds this movie back for me is Otis, but mostly it's the ending. I'm perfectly fine for him to time travel from a story point of view, but the mechanism in which he time travels is a personal pet peeve of mine. Lastly, and controversially, when I want to watch a Christopher Reeve Superman movie, this is not going to be my go-to pick. Much like Superman and the Mole Men, this is a movie that I enjoy more as a piece of comic book movie history than I do as a movie itself. Coming in at number 4 is 2013's Man of Steel. Like I previously mentioned, I consider myself a Zack Snyder fan. That being said, I'm more of a fan of Zack Snyder as a director than I am a DCU Snyderverse fan. This is a movie that I've had a roller coaster relationship with. I saw it at a midnight premiere at my local theater back when midnight premieres were still a thing. I still wish they were a thing. I understand the business point of view as to why they don't do it anymore, but they were so much fun. You go get late night half-apps at Applebee's and then you go watch a movie. And coming out of the theater, I thought this movie was amazing. However, within the next 2 years that followed, my opinion changed quite a bit, primarily because my movie tastes changed. When it first came out, I was like a freshman in high school. I still had this middle school-esque movie taste where I thought like the Transformers, Michael Bay movies were like the greatest thing. And then a couple years later, I was much more of like this cynical, cinephile type of person. And by the time BVS came out, I did not like Man of Steel. However, since then, as I've kind of balanced the two little sides of movie taste for me, I have grown to love this movie and grown to think it's great again. I think this has an amazing Gods Among Us atmosphere that I think works great for DC, because DC is a more mythological universe compared to Marvel, which is more of a realistic take on the universe. I love the score. I love the visuals. The reason it's not higher is because you don't have any mild-mannered reporter Clark Kent, which always makes this feel like it's a Superman movie with something missing. And Amy Adams is a great actress, and she gives a great performance. But that performance, to me, never feels like Lois Lane. Ultimately, it's not higher because I love it more as a Zack Snyder film than I do a Superman film, and this is a ranking of Superman films.
If you'd been wrong, Clark Kent would have been killed.
With a blank?
For a minute.
Bye-bye, baby.
And coming in at number 3 and number 2 is going to be Superman 2. Right now, I would put the Richard Donner cut at 3 and the theatrical cut at 2, which might be slightly controversial, but much like I said with 1978 Superman, it's because of the ending. Up until the ending, I think Richard Donner's version and Richard Donner's cut is far and away better. The reason I prefer Superman 2 over Superman 1 is because, like I mentioned previously, I didn't grow up with the Christopher Reeve movies, and I feel like this is the movie that developed the superhero formula. I do recommend checking out the video that I made where I go more in depth on Superman 2's influence, and I might make a couple far reaches in that video, but I stand by them. When I first watched Superman 2, it was just kind of like Superman loses his powers and my brain goes, oh, that's Spider-Man 2. A villain ransacks a small rural town in the American Southwest. Oh, Thor. A villain ransacks the White House. Oh, X2. And with all of those elements, this was the first Superman movie that did all of those things. 1978's Superman birthed the genre and popularized the genre. But Superman 2 created the formula and the tropes for superhero movies to follow for decades to come. Beyond that, regardless of the cut, I do prefer the Lois and Clark story in Superman 2 over the first Superman. She's not my personal favorite Lois Lane overall, but within the context and the confines of the Richard Donner cut, this version of Lois Lane is probably the best. I also think Terrence Stamp's Zod is one of the best and sometimes forgotten about comic book movie villains, especially when it comes to the pre-modern era.
People were going to die!
Hey, buddy. Eyes up here.
Ultimately, though, recency bias be damned, my favorite Superman movie is the newest one, James Gunn's Superman. This movie brought me so much of what I've been wanting for years, sometimes even decades. I discovered Mr. Terrific in a huge DC Comics encyclopedia that I read constantly as a kid, almost religiously. I destroyed it by reading it so much. And seeing the Olympic level athlete with a genius IQ wearing a T-shaped mask that is so different from everybody else's mask, and seeing the T-spheres that he controls. As a kid, I thought he was the coolest guy in the world. And yes, we did get him in the Arrowverse, and I love Curtis, but that wasn't really truly Mr. Terrific. Beyond Mr. Terrific, I've always been a huge fan of Metamorpho, who I also discovered in a very similar fashion. And even though Guy Gardner is my least favorite Green Lantern, this is still a very accurate portrayal and adaptation of Guy Gardner, and he is the right Green Lantern for this film. Hawkgirl feels like she's taken directly out of the Justice League cartoons I watched growing up, and Superman himself is a perfect Midwestern Boy Scout that just simply wants to be good and do good and make the world a better place. I've seen some people criticize that there isn't enough Clark Kent in this film, and that was a criticism I just gave to Man of Steel a few minutes ago. The difference between this and Man of Steel is in Man of Steel, you don't get any mild-mannered reporter Clark Kent until literally seconds before the credits roll. In this version, you still get a full scene of Clark Kent in the Daily Planet, and you get to see the nuanced differences between the Clark Kent portrayal and the Superman performance. So yes, screen time-wise, it's not a lot, but it's enough to show you the difference. Rachel Brosnahan is a great Lois Lane, while still not necessarily my personal favorite yet, but with future projects, she could easily become my favorite and my Lois Lane. Lex Luthor, I'm still slightly mixed on, but the performance is great, and within the confines and context of this singular film, he's great. I just don't know, universe-wise, if I kind of like the fact that Lex Luthor is already imprisoned and the public already knows about his evil ways. Now, I made my initial review after only one viewing, and I did have a few mixed elements. That being said, I saw it 2 more times over the weekend with a couple different groups of friends, and the more I watched this movie, the more I loved it. I thought it was going to have the exact opposite effect, but no, I loved it even more with more viewings. I was mixed on the Jimmy Olsen, Eve Tessmacher story initially the first time around. By the second viewing, I didn't even notice my issues, and I feel like I watched different scenes during that first viewing. That being said, if you sit back and think about it, it can still be slightly problematic, but it in no way ruins the movie, and you can still have a lot of fun with it. I was also mixed on Ma and Pa Kent, but I think it's because it's such a huge drastic difference from the John Schneider and Kevin Costner versions that I wasn't prepared for. However, Ma and Pa Kent went from being a mixed element to being arguably my favorite element of the movie. I was too focused on it being such a stark difference from the Jonathan Kents I grew up with that I didn't even realize how much Pa Kent reminds me of my late grandfather, a rural Midwestern man who tinkers with things that he probably found at a local swap meet while his wife figures out how modern phones work. Ultimately, he's a simple, kind of out of shape, unassuming man with unexpected wisdom. Plus, he has the same fashion sense as my grandfather. The only thing that I'm still unsure about is the Jor-El and Laura twist. I know some comics and some TV series have explored it. Even Smallville, Jor-El's not the greatest guy, but I'm still unsure about it. Within the confines of this movie, it works perfectly to tackle the nature versus nurture theme of trying to be a good person and what that looks like. Part of me hopes that with future projects, it gets revealed that the human scientists couldn't initially realize it was doctored because it was doctored during or even prior to launch. Maybe it was doctored by Brainiac or Zod or some other villain that could have potentially been on Krypton, preferably Brainiac, because at this point in time, he needs a theatrical movie. When I am in the mood for a Superman movie, James Gunn's Superman is going to be my preferred choice, which leads into why I didn't include the Justice League films. I do prefer Zack Snyder's Justice League to James Gunn's Superman. Zack Snyder's Justice League, not to be confused with the theatrical cut, is an epic movie that I would probably put in my top 10 comic book movies of all time. However, if I want to watch a Superman movie, I will choose James Gunn's Superman, and this is a ranking of Superman movies. And because of that, I didn't want a Justice League movie to be number 1. I know it's kind of a cop-out, and you can lambaste me in the comments if you want. Also, keep in mind that Smallville is still my favorite Superman if you want to include television, but James Gunn's Superman is my favorite Superman movie. Thanks for watching this long-ass ranking of live-action Superman movies. Tell me your favorites in the comments section down below. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you can keep up with your comic book movie historian. And smash that like button if you enjoyed this video, and always stay super.